We're back with some disturbing commentary from Megyn Kelly. But first, my name is Brittany Page, and this is the Page Perspective. I want to take a second to thank everyone who has reached out to show their love and support after Jesse and I received a violent threat this week. A death threat and unfortunately a rape threat. It has been a less than ideal situation, but we are hopeful to have a positive update related to the case in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, this is kind of part of the experience of being an online person, specifically being a woman online, and we're hoping for a positive outcome that we will share when we can. Thank you for your support. Now, we've been witnessing protests on college campuses across the country for the past couple of weeks. College students have been rallying in support for Palestine, calling for their universities to divest from Israel. This means selling investments in companies with ties to Israel. In some cases, college students are also calling for their universities to divest from weapons manufacturers and defense companies. As I sit here now, the death toll in Gaza has exceeded 34,000 people. And 80% of the 2.3 million people who live there have been displaced from their homes. And there have been several notable headlines related to the war in Gaza this week. We saw this one about the Department of State announcing 5 Israeli military units committed gross human rights violations before the war in Gaza. We saw this one about the International Criminal Court preparing to issue arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The International Criminal Court is based in The Hague, Netherlands, where Israel has been investigated for possible war crimes. Now, I'm wondering if you've seen these headlines, or was it just the ones about the campus protesters? Something to consider. We will get into more of this later, but in response to the campus protests, as is typical when we see acts of civil disobedience in this country, the majority of Americans are retreating to their typical talking points about the proper form of protest, even though the vast majority of these college protests have been peaceful until, the police show up. There have been attempts to conflate criticism of Israel's government and the government's brutality against Palestine with anti-Semitism. And let me just say now, so it's clear for everyone, that anti-Semitism is wrong, period. Criticizing Israel's government is not, however, anti-Semitic. And I appreciate that this is a loaded topic for everyone with strong feelings on both sides, but I hope we can all come together to unify against one terrible take, and that is Megyn Kelly's recent take. And listen, every time I talk about Megyn, inevitably someone says, why are you giving her attention? Why am I, with my 42,000 subscribers, giving Megyn Kelly attention? She has almost 2 million subscribers on YouTube, and her show is on Sirius. She doesn't need my attention. She already has the attention of millions. And unfortunately, she can inform and sway people's perspectives, their views, and yes, even their voting behavior. And she seems to take her job very seriously because this was her expert analysis of the protesters.
And by the way, why are they so unattractive? I really legitimately want to know. Why are all the protesters so homely? I don't think they're unconnected. I'm not going to lie. I think attractive, smart people are not drawn to this nonsense. They're living their lives being successful. It's the unattractive and or dumb people who feel the need to do this to feel like they matter. Sorry, hard truths.
So before I get into the more important stuff, I just want to start with the obvious. Who gives a shit what the protesters look like? I mean, imagine going through life with this as your standard for how you deem someone is worthy of listening to. Megyn has, a couple decades on me, so you'd think with some life under her belt, on an existential level, a philosophical level, that she would have thought about or would be thinking about what actually matters in life. Beauty, youth, fleeting. Megyn Kelly could be in an accident tomorrow that could radically disfigure her. And then what would she be left with? Well, unfortunately for her, not even a kind heart, just the legacy of hate and animosity. She works hard to fit into the standard of what society deems attractive, but that could so easily be gone in an instant for any of us. And it doesn't matter. It's unimportant. And these college protesters, they seem to get that, because what are they doing with their time? They aren't in a studio with the perfect lighting and a soft filter to blur those pesky signs of aging. No, they are in the streets demanding change, pushing for change, believing that change is possible. And when Megyn says attractive, smart people are not drawn to this nonsense, you have to ask, what nonsense? Protesting a war that has caused a humanitarian catastrophe with the population on the verge of famine? A couple of months ago now, I think, I read a New Yorker article about the children in Gaza who have lost limbs. And I couldn't help but think of this article when I heard this line from Megyn Kelly about smart people not being drawn into this quote unquote nonsense, that attractive, smart people essentially tune out reality, I guess. They apparently tune out stories like this one about Ghasal Bakar, a 4-year-old. I thought about reading part of her story here, but you would not be able to hear me through the tears. So please take some time and read it for yourself, and know that UNICEF estimates that 1,000 children in Gaza have become amputees since the conflict began in October. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the horror of this war. But I guess it's unattractive to care about that. Right, Megyn? How needlessly cruel and sickening, but also not at all surprising because of what I mentioned earlier about the general inability of Americans to look at protests, acts of civil disobedience, and think critically about the feelings of discomfort that arise in response. And you may be watching this video and maybe you're one of those that has said, I support protests, but not like that. Maybe back in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, maybe now, but often people think about civil rights protests and they think that was the right way to protest back then. Would you have thought that in the 60s? Most Americans did not. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. himself didn't enjoy majority support from Americans until after his death. This from Gallup polls, where they asked Americans to rate how favorable or unfavorable they felt about him. Favorable being represented by 1 to 5, while unfavorable was -1 to -5, with -5 being the lowest position. The total number of Americans giving any unfavorable rating, that is any number from -1 to -5, in August 1966, that's 63%. And 44% gave him a highly unfavorable rating. In August 2011, we see that total unfavorable number drop to just 4%. Let's also take a look at Gallup polls from 1961 to see how Americans felt about things like the Freedom Riders, the groups of civil rights activists who traveled through the South to protest segregated bus terminals, where they also held sit-ins at lunch counters that were designated for whites only. And hopefully we're all aware of this history and the brutality that was used against the Freedom Riders, both by police and white people trying to protect the power structure. According to Gallup, 61% of Americans disapproved of what the Freedom Riders were doing, and 57% of Americans believed these peaceful protest efforts would hurt rather than help the cause for integration. A poll conducted by Gallup in 1963 found similar disapproval, with 60% of Americans having unfavorable feelings about the March on Washington. Progress requires civil disobedience. There is no proper form of protest most Americans will support in the moment. In the 60s, most Americans believed peaceful protests would hurt rather than help. And MLK himself was met with widespread disapproval. It's only now that the majority of Americans can recognize the value of these protests, how they pushed us forward and made us better. When will we learn? What will people think of these protests that are happening today in the decades to come? What will they think of how long it took Americans to come out and demand better for the children in Gaza losing their limbs? People like to pretend they would be on the right side of history, but history tells us that most of us get it wrong in the moment. So listen to young people. Listen to people who believe a better way is possible. Listen to those demanding change, demanding progress. There is nothing more attractive, there's nothing smarter or more worthwhile than that. What do you think? I'd love to know. You can call, leave a voicemail, 657-464-7609, or send an email to idoubt@dollemore.com. I want to take a moment to thank my beautiful new channel members for their support. Thank you to TechMed RR, Frances HD, James J, Amy B, Karen Marie W, Joe T, Lottie D, Stoneflower D, and Deb P. Thank you so much for your support. I could not do this work without you. And again, thank you so much for all of the support and the kind messages that you've been sending our way after the violent threats. I would love to know what you think about this. Please leave a comment below, share with a friend, and I will see you next time.